We'll do a quick intro, one at a time. Just tell us a little bit, just tell us your name, of course, your role, and just kind of what you do for your company. And we'll dig into some obvious questions that we've already discussed earlier. I'm not going to put the answers up. We're going to let it happen in free fall. So
hey, I'm Saari. I work as the marketing director of Fingersoft. I basically oversee everything from corporate branding to community management to UA in the marketing team. And the last year we've spent a lot of time testing new things and sort of building up the operation and how we should do it from now on. And it's been an educational year.
I'm Tarika Soni. I'm from MoPub, which is a Twitter-owned company. My current role is I'm a manager, and I help with adoption of all kinds of ad formats, especially the engaging ones, both on the supply and demand side. And my background has come from a network, DSP, Twitter-owned and operated, and now MoPub.
Hey guys, so I'm Matt Saunders. I'm the UA director at Network. So Network is a game publisher. Our main game is Legendary Game of Heroes. Previous to that, I was a UA director at Zynga, and over my time, 8 years or so in the industry, I've probably tested pretty much every major network. So yeah, I've ran UA for 8 years basically.
Yeah, hi. My name is Jonathan. I work for Miniclip as the head of user acquisition, so I'm overlooking all the user acquisition, paid marketing efforts across multiple titles globally, across a long list of different channels.
Hi, I'm Farhan. I'm the head of UA at Nanobit. I've been there a year or so, and we have a team of around 11, 3 UA managers, 6 artists, and I also manage community. And our major titles are Hollywood Story and My Story, an interactive story app that's doing particularly well at the moment. And we scale UA a lot there. And in the past, I was at Social Point, where I worked on titles like Dragon City and Monster Legends, where we ran God knows how many networks. So, like Matt, I think I've done a lot of them too.
awesome. Great. So let's start where most people start the conversation when they think about UA, and that is with Facebook, Google, other self-attributed networks that are obviously up and coming. Just an open question. I know we have sort of pre-prepped for this conversation. Some people had noted that they wanted to chat about that. Others will chime in. But the question is, how do you view those self-attributed networks, particularly the duopoly of Google and Facebook, when you start your UA today? How might you think that might change, say, 12 to 18 months from now? It may not change in your view. It might, based on what's up and coming elsewhere in a media channel. So I think Matt had said he would talk about this. So yeah, how do you view it today, and what do you think is coming?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, right? So Facebook and Google is pretty much where most people start, and for us as well. When we release new games, we start with those channels, and that's typically because they can drive the highest LTV because they have the most information on the users. I think, but if you think about what's happened in the last kind of 18 months, the way you buy on those channels has fundamentally changed. So it used to be you'd go in, you would find loads of targeting, you would find loads of information, and you would manually put that in and then set a bid. Now it's moved primarily, at least for us, to value optimization and app event optimization. So the UA manager's input has really changed. So instead of us finding loads of information, our input is essentially a budget, a goal, whatever that may be, and creative, right? So I think that trend will continue, and I think what you see with the other networks is they're all trying to follow suit. So pretty much every major network, whether it's a DSP or an SDK network, will have some kind of auto-optimization product which has similar inputs, right? They are yet to be anywhere near as successful as Google and Facebook. My belief is that's because they just don't have the level of data which those guys have. But I think over time that will start to change, and these products will become more and more successful. I see the duopoly of Facebook and Google changing because they just have. The only reason that changes is if the user base itself changes, right? So if Snapchat releases the same tools and their user base becomes mature like Facebook's, then I think that can potentially change. But I think the way you buy on the other networks will change in the next kind of 18 months. So I don't know what anyone else's opinions are.
Yeah. So we started testing Google basically
beginning of last year. There's a weird sort of conflict between Facebook and Google, where both of them have really good things, but none of them have the exact right model, I think. Whereas Facebook is easy to do small things quickly and see if profits come quickly. Google, you need to take a leap of faith in their system, but if it works, you don't really have to work that much anymore. If it works, it just does its thing, and like where Facebook are hands-on, but you can guess things quickly. So if someone can combine those two things, you have a winning model, I think.
I think the only one thing I do want to add here is I've been hearing a lot from yesterday and today is debunking header bidding and in-app bidding. And I think that's the only nuance to the network piece, which might evolve hopefully significantly and quicker this year, 2019. As you already know, MoPub is a preferred partner with FAN, and we're testing advanced in-app bidding with them. So I do see firsthand the sort of investments and changes that are on in buying real time versus the programmatic traditional way. I think that's the only change that I feel will come in 2019 is when FAN fully scales on the in-app header bidding piece.
So you're mentioning FAN, but are you also just suggesting outside of FAN in terms of?
I think once a prominent name like a FAN starts a trend of in-app header bidding, it's tough for others not to follow suit. So I think to stay competitive, they will have to move along with it.
Yeah, we're hearing the same thing, right? The advanced bidding, header bidding, they're interchangeable, will change the landscape outside of the self-attributed networks, and FAN included, right? Because FAN is not part of Facebook's self-attributed wall. So that's interesting. So what I'm kind of hearing is that Facebook and Google are still a good place to start, but we see on the horizon that the other channels have an opportunity to gather the data necessary to sort of start to emulate what happens inside of a self-attributed. Is that sort of summary there?
Yeah, I think most of the channels typically follow suit, right? Excuse me, you follow the market leader, right? And they are behind, and the reason they are behind is because of the data, right? They just don't have as much information, but over time these models become more and more sophisticated, right? So, yeah.
I believe Google's a bit behind Facebook in the sense that switch from AdWords to more black box solution with UAC, and it makes it really tough for smaller developers to spend on Google profitably because the budget required in order for the UAC algorithm to work is quite significant. So with us at Nanobit, we were mostly spending on Facebook up until very recently, where we made enough money where we could throw money into Google. That kind of meant Google has like that huge reach, and obviously the scale is potentially there, but it's really hard for many developers to actually get into that space with Facebook. You can spend a couple $100 and then see some results. That's just not possible on Google. Right? It makes it hard to, when you're launching new titles, to use Google as a testing network, because you're in a position where you don't know when that's going to become profitable, and whether it's a good indication at all, because you have to put so much money in there. So Facebook's always the go-to platform, and that's why I think Facebook, it's a lot easier for developers to use than Google. But having said that, Google's the next behind that, and we use Snapchat heavily, but that's a very specific type of audience. We have like young females, so our scale on Snapchat is larger than Google. But I think, yeah, there's going to be a few other networks coming out, and stuff like TikTok, which is it's doing massively. That probably will be big, and Pinterest is growing. But overall, Facebook is leading the way with VO and AEO, and that's where people are putting all their money.
Good point. I'm glad you brought that up in terms of UAC and the challenges that might exist for an early stage paid campaign. I hadn't really thought about that. Thanks for that. But it's sort of budget restricted, and it might not be the best thing out of the gate for an early stage. So cool.
Yeah, hard to recommend for smaller companies, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. So this panel is a bit about, we started with Facebook, Google, the obvious self-attributed networks, but what about testing partners? Like, how I didn't mention in my introduction, but I run sales for Aarki in Americas and oversee EMEA. Flew in from beautiful Seattle, by the way, so I'm a bit jet lagged, but it's okay. But anyway, I talk to customers all day long, and obviously I'm wanting them to test us as a DSP. And I run across all different types of organizational structures and orientations around how they go about doing that. Some will orientate themselves in a silo. I manage this title exclusively, so title across social, search, and networks, if you will. Some will create a team that's social only for all titles. So there's a lot to it, and I find that there's no consistency around it, and that's okay. We're still a fairly nascent industry, but I do want to hear from you guys in terms of, what do you look for when you get the multiple calls a day and emails from networks, DSPs, et cetera. What do you look for in a partner, and how do you go about that?
Yeah, so in terms of the channel mix, UA channel mix, it's very important that UA managers are careful about what channels they're adding in order to ensure incremental value for their channel mix. So the danger going broader with networks outside the typical channels such as Google, Snapchat, or Facebook is you will hear about loads of network companies that engage in the same ecosystem, the same similar ad inventory, and you step also into areas where fraud becomes a bigger risk. So it can be quite overwhelming, especially if I'm a developer who enters the UA space for the first time. Talking about Google and Facebook are the good starting points, but if I go beyond that, there are loads of companies. I've heard more than 200 networks at any given time are active running UA campaigns. How do I know as a starter which one to trust, which one should I prioritize? There are very few things you can really judge from the outside. So it's about really knowing and asking the right questions around what kind of inventory and what kind of space those networks act. What ad formats, how do my campaigns, how are they shown to the user? Having that right set of questions right from the beginning helps avoid a lot of mistakes.
I think you're completely right, but to take that a step further, we have, and I've always used this, I have essentially a set of questions which I ask, right, which is a pretty standard set. And I think having a standardized kind of question set you will ask is really important, and that way you can treat everyone fairly, right? And I think the crux of it is traffic, right? If I'm going to buy from you, what am I actually buying, right? Who am I buying? How am I buying? If it works for you, it's what works for you, right? If you want more Facebook traffic, then don't sign up a DSP, right? If you want DSP traffic, then don't go and sign up a Facebook agency, right? So understanding that, and I think it is hard to understand who's. I mean, I always use this example. I have maybe 200, 300 LinkedIn requests from salespeople who I don't know, and it's really hard to cut through it, right? And actually, when you think of where the traffic is owned, it's actually a relatively small number of partners. Most of these people are just reselling on top, and you can use events like this, right? Talk to people, use your network to build peer like review is common in any industry, and it is true about ad networks as well, right? I think. People, you can find out relatively quickly who's good and who isn't, or who's a bit shady. Right? So.
It's also not about the quantity. So it's there's this also sense of, okay, the more networks I work with, the more exposure I'm getting, right? But it's not really like that. I've heard about a lot of established UA teams who really have a short list of partners, below 10 partners, and they reach the best results with that. While others who kind of go out and work with 20 plus networks, they struggle, do not actually get what they need.
I think it depends on your game, right? Yeah. So like we over the last year we've been spending like 100K a day with 9 partners, right? We don't, but if you're maybe a slightly more casual game, maybe Farhan, you have a lot more partners. I don't know. Right?
Yeah, when we were at Social Point. For Dragon City, Monster Legends, we were running like an insane amount of partners, like 20, 30 at once. It was an absolute nightmare to manage. And then when we started tracking fraud, we realized that half of them were fraudulent. And then there's lack of transparency as well. That's how we used to really go at the beginning of like, who's transparent? So when you looked at like AppLovin and Vungle, they would say, okay, it's coming from these sources. And then we'd run other guys who couldn't tell us much about what creative is working and where the source is from. And then you're starting to think like, how much money have we invested in these guys that are, you know, either doing like some kind of click injection or like delivering some kind of fraudulent installs. So like there at Social Point for Dragon City, for example, we ran like, let's say 20, 30 partners at once. And there was a rotation as well between knocking back in. But we weren't running Facebook because it wasn't working for that game, which was strange. But the reasoning was that the CPI was too high and it wouldn't back out even with the added conversion. But then now the opposite I have at Nanobit, where we run pretty much 3 or 4 networks and I'm spending $70,000 a day, roughly, on 3 or 4 networks, which is what we talked about earlier, Snapchat, UAC, and Facebook, and not running the other networks because generally they haven't backed out for us because of our ROI targets being very harsh in a short period because we have lower retention. So, but we've had huge scale and we're like now top 40 as of today for My Story in the download charts in the US. So like you don't necessarily need to run more than 3 or 4 networks to be like high in both the grossing and the download charts.
I would like to add some point, which is my method actually when I talk to new people, is this is a very good test for me, is if using this partner means that I need to sync with them every week, does that make my work life better or worse? So it's a really soft test of, do I want to talk to this person even? And if that, usually that passes, like, but like, I'm really strict about that. If I do like this, if I know that a meeting is coming today, it's like, okay, maybe do something else. It's not, nothing is that critical, usually.
That's a good point, and I think I'm going to zoom out, considering you're all UA managers, you all have first-hand experience, so I'm zooming out and thinking more from a supply standpoint, and the reason I'm bringing that up is, we see both, right? Networks and DSPs plugged into the same supply source. So I think with your point, there are very few organic supply sources out there. Everything else is just pretty much being resold. So I think the SDK-based solution is first off the easiest, the least hard work for UA managers because it's not a service box. So that's one tick off. The second thing I've been noticing, at least from 200 plus DSPs that are plugged in, and I think we have about 15 certified ad networks that we work with. We don't work with anything beyond that. So to your point, there are very few that are worth plugging in. What I do see is that spray and pray approach from previous UA managers where you go with 200 networks and then hone in on what works. I think that's dissolving, which is great to see. I think by now everyone knows who they want to work with. Word of mouth matters. And then from what you brought up, I think that's a really interesting point too, and I think a lot of people are not educated on the DSP side when they're trying a DSP for the first time because your first go-to is always fan. And I think the way you're used to capitalizing on a KPI is very CPI heavy. So when you meet a DSP that's making you buy on a CPM, it can be nerve-wracking because you're not used to seeing a figure on a CPM basis, so now you have to do a reverse math. So I think it's really important for this audience to understand that there are types of DSPs as well. There are no types of networks. There are obviously video-first networks and not, but their mechanism of how they buy and logic is the same. DSPs have a managed leg and a self-serve leg. And I think I feel his pain because when I think there's certain criteria you have to look at in terms of maturity of your app. It could mean you have a robust team that runs UA and you want to take everything in-house, and that's fine. Go use a self-serve DSP. You don't have a robust team, you don't have a creative in-house. Your attribution is in-house, it's not through a third party. Those are key factors for why you should be using a managed service. Is you don't have a team yourself, too much effort to run a chaotic system like ours. Second, you don't have a third-party tracker like Kochava, Adjust to post back real-time information to the DSP to make it work. So I think it's really crucial to understand that the DSP lens is not one type. There is a managed service, and I think what will help you in not engaging with that managed service is a lot like, I give you the budget, I give you the KPI, do it, come back to me. Less headache. But then the self-service, you're super involved yourselves, and you're expected to have a team that runs it and looks at it day on day. So I think it's crucial to understand when you're going from the network to a DSP per impression buying mechanism, like choose the right partner. There are 200 plus of them. I think the UA forum or using I think Tune has this certification process where they tell you who are the best partners or where they're seeing the best performance results, or you have partners like MoPub that have a division that's dedicated only to get the advertisers to jumpstart and educate you on what works best for your business. So I think those are channels for you guys to start looking at as well.
Awesome stuff. Thank you. That's great. I just wanted to revert back to one thing that Matt said about, at Aarki, we love the hard questions. And I love that you have a script of what to ask, and we encourage that. And where I'm going with this is there are lots of flavors of networks, DSPs is sort of this intermingling word. But, and Tarika's pointing out it too, is there's not one way to do it, but we like to be asked the hard questions like, what is your QPS volume? Convince me you're 100% programmatic, right? That's a very important question to ask a partner, because there's other ways to sort of cobble together a network or a DSP, and we particularly champion the idea of being 100% programmatic, right? Buying in a unified way across many exchanges. We believe that that's what will be disruptive when, what we talked about earlier, when we get the data that can emulate or simulate some of the things that Facebook and Google are as a programmatic space. So I love what Matt said, so I want to make sure that the audience, take that in, ask your partner. If someone comes to you as a potential partner, ask those hard questions to make sure you look under that hood. I've worked at 2 networks and two DSPs. Kind of been around the block. I understand what's under the hood, and so I really encourage you to ask those.
I think being skeptical is very healthy.
Being skeptical.
I'm British, so I'm naturally quite skeptical. But I think I personally think in this situation it's pretty healthy, right? And another rule of thumb I have is if a salesman tells you their volume, take it at least 30% off, and you might be roughly about there, right? But the people are selling to you, and just like in any forum, right? Just approach that with skepticism.
Yeah. Anything else on that question? Cool. So we're going to get a little bit more nitty gritty on that. What I've heard so far is, we started where normally everyone starts, Facebook, Google, and the self-attributed. We've talked a little bit about asking hard questions outside of that space. But let's talk about when you get through the 200 incoming emails from the sales reps and you decide to take the phone call. What kinds of things do you consider to prioritize? And I'll throw some stuff out there. So there's different pricing models outside of self-attributed. There's CPM, there's CPI. Some folks will throw in some credit to help you get started. There's many different ways. It's really not a consistent marketplace. But maybe give a couple examples or tell me about how you do prioritize. When you've narrowed it down, okay, fine, I'll take your call, and maybe you set up 2 or 3 calls in a week. What do you look for to get somebody?
So in terms of the pricing model, acting in the performance marketing space where everything is trackable, we obviously focus on getting those CPI deals or CPA deals even. So we see an evolution that goes beyond just the install, going forward, similar to Google and Facebook, right? So going beyond the install, trying to achieve results in terms of the in-app events. So these are the things we look for, generally speaking, on CPI or CPA. Obviously, we haven't really talked about the campaign setup in general. We need to make sure that all the technical requirements are obviously checked. So, the tracking support and all the, tools that you need to have. Maybe you have API reporting that you can feed into your reporting dashboards, stuff like that you always check for. And one note on the ad credit or test budget. I know it's obviously a nice proposal, and whenever a network comes and says, hey, 10K free test, it sounds nice, and you think, oh, great, still no risk. but you have to be careful because some networks may also use that as a bait to then, get you really great results. And once you sign that IO and actually pay money, things suddenly turn around. So there are some horror stories, and I would be very cautious with proceeding or just being blind when there's a free budget coming your way.
You've got to be careful. The CPI thing that Jonathan mentions, you just have to be a bit careful there because, for example, we spend $3 an install or more on Facebook, and it hits ROI targets, but then we might use video networks like lights of Vongel Lab in Unity, and we have a CPI of $1 there, and the ROI is worse. So you like three times the difference, yet Facebook is stronger. And the reason is obviously because the conversion to payer we see is far stronger on Facebook because we're optimizing towards purchase. So now some of the networks are optimizing towards purchase or other events, and it's important to be able, I think those guys are going to be the ones that do well because that's getting closer to Facebook. If you're able to target installs based on optimizing towards either purchase or ad revenue, depending on what kind of game you've got, that's going to be important. But in general, I'm hesitant, again, like Matt and Jonathan is with most networks, and I go with the guys I've worked with in the past, or the people I know in the industry, been in it for long enough. But when I am open to new guys, like I started testing a new network that do Snapchat and Instagram influencers. I mean, I did know the guy, he was at Cross Install before, but yeah, there we paid like 1/10 of what we pay on Facebook. So even though the traffic converts 6 times less than it does on Facebook, it's similar to organic traffic. Basically, we still get great ROI. So you got to mix and match these things correctly, but obviously checking with all those fundamentals like fraud and all the other various stuff. But yeah, it's a difficult place if you don't know the industry well. It's difficult to know where to start, and it takes some experience.
I think when it comes to pricing models, whether it's CPI, CPA, CPM, it's all about your attitude to risk, right? So if you're buying CPM, the risk is on you, the app developer. If you're buying CPI, that's lower risk, and more risk is on the network, and even more so CPA, right? So if you are confident, and if you have good data, and if you believe that the algorithm is there, then I think CPM can, and we, in our world, because the game we have is quite hardcore, so our CPIs are super high, right? So if we find a publisher which works, actually we do it because we want that first impression. Would I start with a network doing CPM bidding? No, not unless I knew them really well and I trusted them, but that doesn't happen. But over time, I think you can sound skeptical, but you can move towards that, right? But my opinion is you should take as lower risk as possible. In the end of the day, whatever the DSP is or whatever it may be, it's a lot of it's coming down to the way you want to work with them. To your point, whether it's a managed service or a self-serve, whatever it may be. But it's basically tech. It's how effective is their tech at buying versus another DSP or versus another DSP, right? So.
And I think I'd agree with that, but just the first half, when you've never tried or you're like leaning heavily on organics, I think your approach is absolutely perfect. Like, you should never take that risk to start with, especially when you're trying to gain your first traction or foot in the door to gain paid installs. It's just unhealthy to go with a riskier model.
Yeah.
Touching on that, the DSPs and programmatic and what Matt said, for me that's risk because they often, a lot of them will say we need $25,000 to get stuff to work, and that's for like US iOS, and that will be spent, okay, it's spent over $250 or $200 a day, but it takes time for the exploratory to find the CPI and then find the conversion, but that's a lot of money to commit, you know, even if you're making large amounts, maybe you'd rather put that on Facebook where you know you can get it back. So that's hard to test DSPs, particularly I find, because if you put that money in and it doesn't work on that DSP, you think, okay, I'm not going to use DSPs at all.
Yeah.
I get that a lot, by the way. You're absolutely right. Because we do this sort of a consulting thing where we get UA guys to try DSPs who've tried networks. And I think the best approach that they come up with is, we know our audience. And I think, to Matt's point earlier, once you're confident of your audience and confident of a CPI/ROI that you want to achieve from these users, the typical way that I've always encouraged anybody to go into the DSP world is do a lookalike. Just go blind with what you know works and find something similar in that space, because that's when you're not burning money. It's not like the exploratory phase is what costs the DSP a lot of money and costs you money because they need time and energy for it. The post-backs have to come in at a certain threshold for it to be statistically significant, right? To draw cohorts from. But if you already have that data from Facebook and you can upload that into the DSP and say, start from here, I think that's less of a risk. And I've just seen that as a great tactic that works without much of a risk on the DSP.
I think if you're discerning about who you test, you might not test that many, right? I don't actually, but when I do go into a test, I go into it with this should be successful. I want it to be successful, right? So I always work really closely with any network on how we can help each other be successful, right? If your traffic is if you're really strong in the US on Android, well, let's test there. Let's not try and, you know what I mean? And to Farhan's point, it does cost a lot of money, right? So you have to go into it with a strong sense that you can work together and it's going to work, and work to the network strengths as well as yours, right? Don't try and shoehorn them to be something they're not.
Yeah, I mean, I love where this is going. This is kind of a breakthrough conversation in the sense that, thinking about those hard questions to ask, right? I will emphasize again, I think from the programmatic space, it's still nascent, it's new, we're doing a lot of education in the market, but we'd love to have you uncover those things with us, which means are we stronger in Android or iOS? What can we do together to be successful? I think it comes from a fundamental understanding that we believe programmatic will work one day, right? And that how can we allay some of the fears that kind of has maybe been there, but asking those questions like where can we start to be most successful? I have those questions a lot. I will segue though what you said about the weekly meetings and the big sigh of I have to have a weekly meeting because we need to keep track of how it's doing. Right before I joined Aarki last year, I was at a Facebook agency. I get it, right? I know Ads Manager. It's like plug and play, AEO, off I go, and it's. So we want to work together and try and figure out how, if you were to consider a test with someone that's outside of those networks, the next question actually, what kind of things are you really hands-on? Would you prefer to be hands-off? Would you love it if, that space operated very autonomously for you?
For us at least, we have great success with Google, but it took a leap of faith. In the beginning, we are in the position to take that leap of faith without crashing the company, and it worked. And when it works, it's pretty good. But just finding the reliability there that whenever you start something new, it's gonna do the same thing. It's really hard to be confident in that. But when it works, of course, it just does all the work for you that you would be doing in Facebook, hands-on. So, and we had there it worked really well that we had a contact that we synced up with, and then they were real helpful and sort of heard our pain and understood if something went wrong. We could sort of trust the fact that they will meet us in the middle if something goes wrong. And this is important.
I said at the start, I think the role of the UA manager will kind of change, right? So it'll go from picking out all of these targeting things, yada, yada, to essentially, this is my target, I do the targets correct, this is my budget, this is how much I want to spend, and this is my creative input, right? And if in that world, as a UA manager, actually you're relatively hands-off, right? Your input is creative, and you might use technology to do that. You can do many different things, right? I think an ideal world, that would be great. But we're not there with the vast majority of networks yet. And maybe they'll get there over time, right? So at the moment, today, if I still going to have to be in the data, I'm going to have to, or my team will be, and we'll have to be, is this working, is this not working, blacklist, whitelist, whatever that may be. But I think my eventual goal would be, great, here's a budget, here's creative, I trust you, right? But there's a long way to go to build that yet.
And maybe you look at a dashboard every now and then and
yeah,
okay,
exactly.
it's going.
I mean, sure.
But yeah, that.
Yeah. And then the thing you as a UA manager is moving budget around between what's working and what isn't working, right? Rather than being individually.
Yeah.
And that's an idyllic place to be, and I think we all aspire to be there. That's I think in everyone's mind. You mentioned something briefly that we didn't talk about before, but making sure that your target is right. You just said that. One day you'll have a target. That's an interesting point because I run across folks that have a gamut of understanding of their monetization, right, and so therefore what their target is. Any thoughts on that in terms of, early stage game that maybe not be as saturated as another? Do you feel like that there's a here's my target today, but here's my target out here in the future?
I think you should always go for as deep a target as possible where you are confident the results will be correct. right? And so what I mean by that is, when you've got a game with 2 years of data, you have a really good LTV curve, you know what it is. When you don't have that, you've got a brand new game, you've got nothing to base it on. It could be a completely new game to your company. It could be your first game, right? You need to go, okay, so what can I look at? What can I look at quickly? And how do I maximize that metric, whatever that metric may be, whether it's retention, revenue, ads served, or whatever that may be. I think you just always have to be buying against the kind of most complex, and don't be afraid to review it constantly. We review our, so I mean, we use machine learning and our LTV predictions get better every day, right? But we've got a lot of data, but you know, we've got games in soft launch where we don't have that data, right? So we'll start buying against cost per, whatever it may be, cost per day 7 retained user, for argument's sake, right? Whatever that may be, because that's where we're confident we have lots of data which we can get early and we can start to weed things in and out. But then over time that will change to payers and that kind of thing. But it depends on the goal of your game. But I think, yeah, just go for as deep a target you can, within time frame reasons, right?
I was just going to say, I think it can be quite hard to know who to target. And a lot of games companies, ones I've worked at, they don't know really actually who their target audience is. They can't specifically define it. And the audience is quite varied, and it's not one kind of person who plays that. It's not like a 16-year-old boy who plays it. This can be quite a large range. And it's understanding those guys, and they can be worth different values as well. And these days, with the lookalike audiences that you do bidding on, you don't really even need to know who they are. You can just take lookalikes for your payers, and then you like, okay, this is similar to what we know pay already in our game, and we're going to target those. So that's why Facebook and some of the other platforms are kind of ahead, because they're able to target those guys, while lookalikes haven't been very prevalent. I know now Tarika says that it's now DSPs are able to do that, which is the way it has to go, because when you have that broad targeting, if you're just targeting hyper-casual games, maybe they have their users that could purchase in your game, but you're going for such a broad chunk of users that you don't know what's happening there. So targeting is a tricky one, because I think a lot of games developers don't often know who they should be targeting. They just want everyone to play their game.
And this is also where I feel like the marketers or the UA managers have to really be very close with the product team, with the developers, and the designers of the monetization of the game. Really, you can't, be in separate rooms trying to achieve your own goals. You really need to have this discussion around, okay, what are the product updates? So you mentioned the soft launch. I feel like it's a crucial element of any launch to have a soft launch, to really explore what my game can achieve within a small environment, test environment. We talked about how Facebook is a safe environment where you can control your budget at a low scale, with good results, creative testing, etc. And always keep the product teams involved, because they will be the ones who feedback as well on things like user journey. Why is day 7 retention not as strong as the other game? Why is it so low compared to the benchmarks we set? And then really go step by step. You have to do your own homework, and only if you do that, you can go to the networks and inform them about what you want to achieve.
Yeah, that was actually, I think are we close on time? Is there someone in the room? Oh, we're out of time. Yep. Can we get 60 seconds or, okay. So the last two questions we did have was, how do you interact with your BI teams, product teams, et cetera? So thanks for touching on that. And then, how do you organize your buying team? Some of you have a single title, some have multiple titles. Any thoughts really quick on, do you organize and orientate your team based on everything, social search and networks, et cetera, or vice, other way around?
So super quickly, I oversaw a change at Zynga from when we went from owning products to networks, right? So we went through that change. So originally I ran the natural motion games, and then some guys in San Fran ran the Zynga games, and then we became one team and we switched to running networks. And the reason we did that was kind of to your point. So being close to a product is a really good thing, right? And if you own that product, then that's great. But actually we found it on the UA side, we lost out a little bit, right? Because networks didn't know the contact, and it was just getting a bit messy. And what I found is, you're sat in the office with the product team, right? So what we do at Network is we are responsible for channels, but we always have a product champion, right? So it's kind of still the same thing, and that person is responsible for the strategy of the game and updating the product team every day and stuff like that. But from a network point of view, they know I can speak to Matt or I can speak to a colleague X. That's how we do it.
It's exactly how we operate as well. We we have UI managers dedicated to certain products on a top level view, but for specific networks, because those networks become also very sophisticated and require a lot of detail expertise. So we try to have for the social channels, especially for the UAC or search. It's definitely very
One
beneficial.
super quick to add to that, I find it's quite good to rotate people around. So people pick up different skills, right? And that's a really good thing. So we'll have someone who runs Facebook for X period of time, and then maybe they'll swap to Google. And then that, especially if they're junior staff, because it helps build up their, and that's something I've always found has worked
That's
pretty
a
well.
smart idea. That shouldn't be overlooked because buying Facebook UAC and programmatic, frankly, if you look at the kind of the three, it has its own elements to it. And teaching someone Facebook is not an easy thing, right? I mean, that is an undertaking. So I like the fact that you're rotating them around. Do we have time for questions? No. All right. Thanks, you guys. Appreciate it. Thanks for joining. Hope it was good for you all. Thanks.